In the east of Egypt's Nile Delta, investigators unearthed treasures hidden for more than 3,000 years.
Abydos, Egypt, 300 miles south of Cairo. Looters target what was once the most sacred site to the ancient Egyptians during the time of the pharaohs.
What if the oldest name of God wasn't revealed to Moses, but recorded by his enemies? In 1400 BC, an Egyptian pharaoh carved a list of the nations he had crushed: Nubians, Hittites, Syrians, and one name that didn't belong: Shasu Yahweh, the wanderers of Yahweh.
And the name Yahweh is mentioned in the Old Testament 6,823 times. But today I want to talk about the oldest Yahweh inscription that's ever been found.
Not Israelites, not a kingdom, but a group of desert nomads worshiping a god the chosen people supposedly didn't even know yet. While Israel was enslaved in Egypt, forgetting its heritage, someone else was out in the desert keeping the flame alive. This is the story of the outsiders who preserved what the insiders had lost. A hidden branch of Abraham's family whose devotion survived centuries of neglect and whose story challenges everything we thought we knew about faith, history, and the origins of God's name. The hit list. The temple sits on the west bank of the Nile River, roughly 100 miles south of the Egyptian border in what is now northern Sudan. It is a ruin today, mostly sand and broken pillars baking in the heat. But 3,400 years ago, this was the temple of Soleb, built by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, the grandfather of King Tutankhamun and one of the most powerful rulers in human history. Amenhotep was obsessed with his own greatness. He constructed this temple to celebrate his military victories, and like most ancient kings, he wanted his enemies memorialized in stone, not as honored opponents, but as humiliated captives. If you walk through the ruins today, you can still see the pillars where he carved their names. Each figure is depicted as a prisoner with hands bound behind the back, defeated and broken. On each prisoner's chest is a shield bearing the name of their tribe or territory. The Nubians are there, the Hittites, the Syrians, names that appear in history textbooks, peoples who clashed with Egypt across centuries of warfare. But on one specific pillar, there is an inscription that stopped archaeologists cold when they first translated it.
When archaeologists discovered that temple, they found an Egyptian hieroglyphic that appears to show the Hebrew tetragrammaton, YHWH, or Jehovah.
It describes a group of nomads who lived in tents and wandered the deserts east of Egypt. The Egyptians called them Shasu, their word for the wild, untamable Bedouin of the Bronze Age. But the inscription does not simply call them nomads. It identifies them by their deity, Shasu Yahweh, the Shasu of Yahweh. This is not a geographical designation. This is a theological one. Amenhotep III knew the name. He knew exactly who worshipped it, and he knew they lived in the deserts of Seir and Edom, far from the land of Canaan, far from the people we call Israel. Consider the timeline. This inscription was carved around 1400 BC. If the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC, as many scholars believe, then Moses and the Israelites had already left Egypt. They had already received the law at Sinai. They were already wandering the wilderness. But when Amenhotep carves this name, he does not link it to a new nation invading Canaan. He links it to the Shasu, the nomads of the south. To the Egyptians, the name Yahweh was firmly anchored to the geography of Midian and Edom. This was not a new revelation that appeared with Moses. This was an ancient tradition attached to a people who had been worshiping in the desert for generations. The question that hangs over this inscription is devastating in its implications. If Israel was the chosen people, if they were the exclusive recipients of God's name and covenant, then who were these others? And how did they know the name that was supposed to be the most sacred secret in the universe? The Great Amnesia. To understand who these desert worshippers were, we first have to understand what was happening inside Egypt. we have to confront an ugly truth that the Sunday school version of Exodus usually skips over. The Israelites were not just slaves. They were Egyptians, not ethnically, but culturally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. They had lived in Egypt for over 200 years by the time of the Exodus. Generations had been born and died in the shadow of the pyramids. They had absorbed the most dominant, seductive, powerful civilization on earth, and in the process, they had forgotten who they were. The prophet Ezekiel pulls back the curtain on this period in chapter 20 of his book. God does not speak about Israel's suffering in Egypt. He speaks about their seduction. He says that when Israel was in Egypt, he told them to throw away the vile images they had set their eyes on and not to defile themselves with the idols of Egypt. But they rebelled. They would not listen. They did not throw away the detestable things. They did not forsake the idols of Egypt. This is the detail we usually ignore. The Israelites were worshiping the gods of their masters. They were bowing to Ra. They were fearing Osiris. They were fascinated by the magic and the power of the Nile.
Abydos was considered sacred to the god Osiris, Lord of the Dead, and Egypt's first otherworldly ruler.
And in the process, something critical was lost. It had been centuries since Joseph died. Centuries since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob walked with God. Over those long, silent years, the personal identity of their God had faded from collective memory. They knew there was a God of their fathers. They remembered fragments of stories. Perhaps they knew the title El Shaddai, God Almighty. But the personal relationship, the covenant name, the specific theology of who this God was and what he demanded, that knowledge had been buried under centuries of pagan assimilation. This is the true crisis of Exodus. Israel was not just physically enslaved, they were spiritually dead. The signal had been lost in the noise of Egypt. If God appeared at that moment and said his name, the Israelites would have stared back with blank faces. The name meant nothing to them anymore. It was a relic from a grandfather they had never met. The backup plan. Here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. While the lights were going out in Egypt, they were burning bright somewhere else. We tend to read the Bible with tunnel vision. We focus so intensely on Isaac and Jacob that we forget Abraham had a much larger family. We forget that Isaac was not his only son. And I am not talking about Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 25, there is a detail that changes everything. After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife named Keturah. She bore him 6 sons. 6 sons who grew up at the feet of Abraham. 6 sons who heard the stories of the stars and the covenant and the promise. One of those sons was named Midian. Now watch what Abraham does with these children. The text says that while he was still living, Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away to the east, away from his son Isaac. We usually read this as rejection. We see it as Abraham protecting the inheritance, clearing the estate for the chosen heir. But what if it was not rejection at all? What if it was a mission? They did not receive the land. That was for Isaac. They did not receive the covenant blessing to become the nation through which the Messiah would come. That was also for Isaac. But they received the faith. Think about where Abraham sent them. He sent them east, into the desert, away from the corruption of the cities, away from the Canaanites and Egyptians and empires that would eventually seduce Isaac's descendants. He sent them to the wilderness. And in the ancient world, the wilderness is where you go to preserve things. The desert strips away the non-essentials. It forces reliance on what cannot be seen. While Isaac's descendants were slowly forgetting God in the luxury and then the slavery of Egypt, Midian's descendants were out in the wild, under the open stars, preserving the traditions of their father Abraham. They became the backup system. God knew the primary line was going to fail. He knew the pressure of Egypt would be too much. He knew they would forget his name. So he stored the data with the other branch of the family. He hid the truth in the one place the Egyptians would never look, the tents of a nomadic tribe in the Arabian desert. The School of the Desert. This brings us to the Kenites. The Kenites were a clan within the Midianite people. The name itself, Kayin in Hebrew, means smith, as in blacksmith or coppersmith. These were the masters of metallurgy, the keepers of ancient technology. They were wanderers and craftsmen, moving through the rocks and heat, living a life that looked very much like the life Abraham himself had lived. They did not build statues. They did not assimilate into empires. They kept the old ways. And for 400 years, from Abraham to Jethro, while Israel was worshiping frogs and beetles and the sun disk, the Kenites were worshiping the God of the mountain. They were remembering the name that Israel forgot. Now watch how God orchestrates the rescue. Moses kills an Egyptian taskmaster and flees for his life. He thinks he is running away, a fugitive with no future, looking for a place to hide. But he is not running away. He is being enrolled. Look at where he ends up. He does not go north to Canaan, where his ancestors were promised land. He goes south and east, straight into the territory of the rejected sons of Abraham. He goes to Midian. The text tells us he sits down by a well, and the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian arrive. We usually assume this priest, called Jethro or Reuel.
In Exodus chapter 2, verse 21, Moses' father-in-law is named Reuel. Then in chapter 3, verse 1, he's called Jethro.
Was some kind of pagan holy man worshiping local desert spirits. We assume Moses eventually converts him to the truth. But what if we have that exactly backwards? Remember, Israel has been in Egypt for centuries. They have forgotten God's name. They are spiritually comatose. But Jethro is a direct descendant of Abraham through Midian. He has been living in the wilderness, keeping the patriarchal traditions alive. He is not a pagan priest. He is a priest of El Elyon, the God Most High. He is the spiritual counterpart to Melchizedek, the mysterious king of Salem who blessed Abraham centuries earlier. Both are priests of the true God standing outside the official family tree. Jethro is the keeper of the flame in the desert. Moses spends 40 years in Midian. 40 years. This was not a waiting room until the pharaoh died. This was a complete reprogramming. Moses had spent his first 40 years learning to be an Egyptian prince, learning that power comes from chariots and armies and political maneuvering. Now he had to unlearn all of it. He entered Jethro's household. He married his daughter Zipporah. He became a shepherd for the family flocks. And around those campfires for 4 decades, he learned the theology that his own people had thrown away. He learned about the God who cannot be carved or drawn, the God of the mountain, the God whose name the Kenites had never forgotten. The mountain. This is where geography meets theology. Notice where God finally speaks to Moses. We call it the burning bush moment, the dramatic pivot point of the entire Exodus narrative. But look carefully at the text in Exodus chapter 3. Moses is tending Jethro's flock. He leads them to the far side of the wilderness and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. Stop there. It is called the mountain of God before God speaks to Moses there. This was not a random hill that God decided to visit on that particular day. It was already known as the mountain of God. Why? Because the Midianites and Kenites had been worshiping there for generations. This was their sanctuary. This was their cathedral in the wilderness. Jethro had likely pointed to that peak and told Moses, "That is where he dwells. That is where the God of Abraham meets with us." God did not meet Moses in a vacuum. He met Moses in the Kenite sanctuary, in the place where the Shasu of Yahweh said he could be found. The desert was not waiting for Moses to bring the truth. The desert was waiting to give the truth back to Moses. The student was finally ready to graduate. The prince of Egypt had died in the sand. The shepherd of Yahweh was ready to be born. The proof stories are easy to tell. History requires evidence. If we are going to claim that God was being worshipped by a tribe of nomads in Arabia while Israel was still enslaved in Egypt, we need more than theories. We need proof. And the proof exists, buried in sand and carved in stone. The Soleb inscription is the first receipt. It proves the Egyptians knew the name Yahweh and associated it with the Shasu nomads of the southern desert, not with Israel. But a name on a temple wall is one thing. A place of worship is another. If these people truly knew God, where did they worship Him? They were nomads. They did not build cathedrals, except they did once when they decided to build something that would survive the centuries. Welcome to the Timna Valley, deep in the Arabah between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. This place is a furnace, but it is also a treasure chest. It sits on one of the largest ancient copper mining operations in the world.
The Timna copper mines and the landscape of the Arava are a picturesque background to the hydrological engineering operation carried out by the National Water Company, Mekorot, with the use of Golan plastic products Pexgol pipe.
The Egyptians controlled this area in the 13th and 12th centuries BC, running massive smelting operations to fuel their bronze industry. Where the Egyptians went, their gods went. They built a temple here to Hathor, the cow goddess, the Lady of Turquoise. Standard Egyptian religious architecture. But then around the middle of the 12th century BC, the Egyptian empire collapsed. The Bronze Age ended. The Egyptians packed up and abandoned their mines, and this is where the story turns extraordinary. The moment the Egyptians left, the Midianites and Kenites moved in. Archaeologists have found that these nomads took the Egyptian temple and completely transformed it. They did not just repaint the walls. They changed the entire theology of the architecture. They tore down the image of Hathor. They erased the faces of the Egyptian gods. And they erected a heavy fabric tent over the courtyard, a tent shrine in the middle of a mining camp. The layout of this Kenite sanctuary is eerily similar to the tabernacle described in Exodus. It had a courtyard. It had a holy place. It had a tent structure covering the sacred space. The same architectural language, but this was not Israelite. This was Midianite. And inside the holy place, archaeologists found something that connected the dots with shocking clarity. Lying in the dust was a small copper serpent, 5 inches long, with a gold-gilded head. In Numbers chapter 21, the Israelites are dying from snake bites in the wilderness. God tells Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole so that anyone who looks at it will live. In 2 Kings chapter 18, King Hezekiah destroys that same bronze serpent because the people had started worshiping it. The serpent on the pole was a symbol unique to Mosaic theology. And here it is, in a Midianite shrine, predating or contemporaneous with Moses. The iconography of the Kenites and the iconography of Moses were the same. They shared a theology. They shared a symbol system. This little copper snake is physical proof that the connection was real. And then there is the technology. The word Kenite literally means smith. These people were the masters of metallurgy, the ones who knew how to transform rock into bronze. Think about what Israel needed when they left Egypt. They were a nation of brickmakers. They knew how to mix mud and straw. But they were headed into a wilderness where they would need to fight wars, build a tabernacle with bronze fittings, and survive in terrain that would kill the unprepared. Who taught the bricklayers to work metal? Who showed them how to survive in the land of rock and sand? It was not a miraculous download of knowledge. It was the Kenites. They had the technology, they had the survival skills, and most importantly, they had the God. The reunion. Exodus chapter 18 is one of the most overlooked passages in the entire story, but it is the climax of this mystery. Israel has come out of Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea. They have fought their first battle, and they arrive at the camp near the mountain of God. Look who rides out to meet them. Jethro, the Kenite priest, Moses' father-in-law. He is not coming empty-handed. He brings Moses his wife and 2 sons. But this is not just a family reunion. This is a summit meeting between two branches of Abraham's family that have not seen each other for centuries. Moses sits down and tells Jethro everything: the plagues, the Red Sea, the rescue. And listen to Jethro's response. He says, "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods." For years, commentators have interpreted this as the moment Jethro converts, the pagan priest finally realizing that Israel's God is real. But that reading is backwards. Jethro is not discovering a new God. He is seeing his faith confirmed. He already believed. Now he has proof. He has been worshiping El Elyon in the desert his entire life. He has been keeping the flame alive. But he has never seen God destroy an empire before. He has never seen the sea split. When he hears the story, he is not converting. He is celebrating. He is saying, "I knew it. I always knew. And now I have the evidence." Then something extraordinary happens. Verse 12 says that Jethro brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. Who is officiating this sacrifice? Not Moses, not Aaron, Jethro, the Kenite, the so-called outsider, and it gets more remarkable. The text says Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Picture that scene. Aaron, the future high priest of Israel, the man who will wear the sacred breastplate and enter the Holy of Holies, is sitting at a sacrificial meal officiated by a Midianite nomad. If Jethro were a pagan, this would be blasphemy. You do not let a pagan priest lead worship for the elders of Israel. But Jethro is not a pagan. He is the senior clergyman in the room. He is the only one present who holds an unbroken line to the priesthood of the patriarchs, and in this moment, Aaron and the elders are recognizing his authority. They are sitting at his table. This is the passing of the torch. The keeper line, the Kenites who preserved the faith in the desert, is handing the spiritual heritage back to the heir line, the Israelites who are about to inherit the promises. But the story does not end there. Eventually, the camp has to move. The cloud lifts. The trumpet sounds. Israel must head toward Canaan. And Moses realizes something terrifying. He knows how to be a prince in Egypt. He knows how to command armies and negotiate with pharaohs. But he does not know how to survive in the desert. He looks at the millions of people following him, the bricklayers and city dwellers and former slaves, and he realizes they are going to die out there. They do not know where the water is. They do not know which trails to take. So Moses turns to the Kenites. Specifically, he turns to Jethro's son, Hobab. Numbers chapter 10 records the conversation. Moses says, "Please do not leave us, because you know where we should camp in the wilderness. You will be our eyes." This is the general of Egypt begging a Bedouin nomad for help. And the Kenites went. They did not disappear back into the dunes. They cast their lot with the covenant people. They were the original wild olive branch grafted into the family tree centuries before Paul ever wrote his letter to the Romans. The story of the outsiders saving the insiders is far from a chapter sealed in the past. The Kenites, the Shasu of Yahweh, the forgotten voices in the wilderness, they challenge everything we thought we knew about faith, lineage, and who carries the light forward. They remind us that preservation does not always follow the paths of power or the lines of inheritance. If a hidden tribe could safeguard the ancient faith while the chosen nation struggled, what else has history overlooked? And more importantly, who today is keeping what we have forgotten alive, quietly shaping the world while the institutions sleep? The answers are out there, buried in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. And this story is only beginning to unravel. The deeper we look, the more the past whispers, and the more urgent the questions become. What truths remain hidden, and who will have the courage to uncover them?